Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon are the hardest games in the main series, and I'm gonna attempt to beat a Hardcore Nuzlocke, which means if any Pokemon faints, it has to be boxed forever. I only get to catch the first fighting type I find per route, and because of the hardcore rules, I always have to play on set mode and can't overlevel the next boss fight. And there are some crazy bosses in this game that destroy fighting types. So let me know your favorite fighting type down in the comments below while you like and subscribe. We begin the challenge on Route 2, where conveniently there's only one fighting type to pick up. It's also the only fighting type we can get before the first boss fight, so Makuhita's gonna have to do. Speaking of the first boss, I'm playing Ultra Sun, so I'll be fighting Gumshoos instead of Raticate. Once we reach Akala, I also have a mandatory fight versus Dexio's Espeon instead of Cena's Glaceon. What's my exclusive reward for the extra challenge? Well, in Ultra Sun we can catch Passimian. Yeah, nobody has this thing as their favorite Pokemon, but having access to an extra Pokemon is probably worth it. Probably. Conveniently, as we make our way through the first trial, we pick up the TM for Brick Break. But even with such a strong move, I'm still afraid of the first trial. Gumshoos is a much tougher boss than Alolan Raticate for the simple reason that it's not quad weak to fighting. Pair that with the fact that its aura gives it a defense boost at the start of the fight, and we're definitely not going to be one-shotting this thing. I'm struck by a Super Fang, immediately taking out half of Makuhita's health the first turn of the fight. I strike back with a Brick Break, which unfortunately falls short of taking Gumshoos into the yellow. The fight then becomes a 2-on-1 when Gumshoos calls in a Yungoos. The Yungoos hits me with a Tackle, which activates my Oran Berry to take me back above half health again. And with the berry, I'm actually able to survive a Tackle from Gumshoos. Amazingly, my second Brick Break is a higher roll and actually manages to take Gumshoos out. The Yungoos then deals exactly 9 damage, but because of the level up, I gain 3 points of HP, I'm able to survive and beat the fight. Already, we're just barely holding on. On Route 3, there's 2 possible encounters, but unless we encounter Hawlucha, we have to restart the run. Fortunately, it's the very first thing I run into, but unfortunately, it locks us out of ever getting Mankey in the run. As much as I love the Mankey line, this is a small cost to pay because Hawlucha is a really strong Pokemon to get this early in a very unforgiving early game. Its flying typing also means we completely destroy Hala and finally get to leave this Arceus Forsaken Island. Just before we do so, however, I make sure to head to 10 Carat Hill, which is the only location where we can pick up a Machop. Before I leave this island to never ever return, I also make sure to decimate the population of Pikipek. Admittedly, this is one of the slowest ways to reach level 19 possible. However, that also means we can pick up a huge amount of attack EVs on the way. The reason it's so important to almost get to the next level cap as soon as we reach Akala is because we have to face this idiot. The guy has a straight up Psychic team, including a level 15 Espeon. That Espeon also has Psybeam, which if it connects with Piccolo, even at level 19, straight up one-shots. And while an Aerial Ace is enough to take out Mime Jr., Espeon always survives a non-crit. Thus, I had to spend some time getting battle points from Mantine Surf in order to pick up Bounce. Also that I could stake the entire future of the run on an 85% hit rate. Dexio, I hate you. There is an encounter we could have picked up on Route 2 and 3, however Route 4 is perfect to pick up Crabrawler since it doesn't conflict with any other encounters. Which leads us to facing the second totem of the game. Araquanid on its own is incredibly threatening with that water bubble ability, but pair it with permanent rain and a boost to its speed? Yeah, the bosses are already getting out of control, and the only thing we have going for us is Hawlucha's flying type. Hawlucha is also insanely fast, so we outspeed even after Araquanid's speed boost, taking it below half with an Aerial Ace. I'm struck back by a rain and water bubble boosted bubble that takes me below half, healing me up with an Oran Berry. This also activates Unburden, but we were already faster. Because Araquanid's taken a bunch of damage, it calls in Masquerain instead of Dupiter, which is actually much better even though it intimidates us. Because of the Intimidate, however, an Aerial Ace won't be enough to take out Araquanid's remaining health, so I'm forced to risk it with Bounce. Masquerain just goes for Tailwind, which doesn't matter at all since I've already doubled my speed with Unburden, meaning that even through the Tailwind, Bounce connects first the next turn, taking out the Araquanid. In theory, this is still a dangerous situation if the Masquerain had any flying type moves. However, since it doesn't, we can just take it out with an Aerial Ace the next turn, winning us the trial. With Araquanid out of the way, we can kinda pick up our next encounter in Poliwag. It doesn't actually turn into a fighting type until it fully evolves into Poliwrath, which we're locked out of until we can get a Water Stone and the level cap's higher than 25. This kinda sucks since a water type would have been incredibly useful for the next trial. This is where things really start to ramp up in difficulty. Before we get to take on Totem Marowak, we have to fight a regular Marowak and Hiker David. We don't get to heal between any of these fights or the Totem fight, and the Totem Pokemon is insanely unpredictable because of Detect. I don't allow any stat stat boosting moves in my current Hardcore Nuzlocke rule set, so we can't try to be productive while it goes for Protect anyway. The one good thing about these first fights is the level cap applies as we enter the trial, meaning we can get all our team members to level 23. I don't lose any health fighting the Magmar, however, as I take it down in a single bounce, it activates Flame Body. It's not a huge deal since I can shake it off with a Lumberry, but I'd really like to save the berry for Salazzle's Poison Gas. As we enter the fight versus the actual Totem Pokemon, I don't really want to lead with Piccolo. This means we'll have to switch the very first turn, and whatever I swap in is going to get hit hard with a Flame Wheel. That's at least what I initially thought. However, realizing that it can't actually one-hit KO me with a Flame Wheel, I can pretty safely swap into a Detect. We wouldn't have been able to hit it anyway before it calls in Salazzle, so switching out into our lead Pokemon is as productive as we can be. Salazzle takes the first turn to poison us, so it can destroy us the next turn with Venoshock. I survive a Brick Break, but this turn is all Makuhita needs to hit the Marowak with a knockoff, dealing massive damage, but more importantly, knocking off its Thick Club. This unfortunately comes at the steep cost of Makuhita's life, but it was a life well spent. The next turn is an absolute disaster as I send in Crabrawler. Marowak, of course, goes for Detect as Salazzle mercifully hits me with Torment. I then waste my turn by pursuing the Detect. For some reason, Marowak tries to go for Detect again, which gives me a free opportunity to go for Leer to lower both of the Pokemon's defense. Sadly, that's the extent of Crabrawler's contribution in the run, since it gets destroyed immediately the next turn by a Venoshock. I send in Hawlucha, which luckily kinda has a move that completely counters Detect. Since Bounce is a 2-turn move, and because Marowak went for Detect, we can pretty much guarantee we connect the next turn. We're also able to dodge Salazzle's Flame Burst while we're in the air, and because of the defense drop, one bounce is actually enough to just take Marowak out. Salazzle hits me with a Flame Burst as I come down, so I decide to go for a Roost the next turn to get most of my HP back. However, this is not a sustainable strategy since the next Flame Burst takes me down lower. I ultimately decide I just need to send it, fling myself into the air with Bounce. It does connect despite its shaky accuracy, winning me a fight I thought would be much tougher. I mean, I did lose 2 Pokemon, but you know what I mean. From here, we pretty much immediately have to take on the Grass Trial. Luckily, this trial is a lot more straightforward because of Hawlucha's Flying type, since Lurantis only has resisted moves. My first attack easily takes out half of its health, which calls in Comfey instead of Kecleon. Kecleon would make my life really hard by actually dealing damage to me. That's not to say that Comfey isn't incredibly annoying too. Lurantis can heal up its own HP with Synthesis. Comfey then has the annoying move Flower Shield that boosts Lurantis' defense. This combo means I keep doing less and less damage, and they can stall for a really long time. This strategy of theirs would actually work since Lurantis' resisted Solar Blade actually deals a decent amount of damage. The one problem for Lurantis is that I can just heal up myself with Roost. My odds in this fight are just way better, especially since I could at any point get a 1 in 16 critical hit. And with Lurantis defeated, we get access to our next encounter here in the lush jungle. That's right, it's the Rugby Monkey, and it's actually surprisingly strong at 120 base attack. We next head to Coney City, where we can actually pick up a Water Stone, which finally gives us access to Poliwrath, who's just a bigger, angrier Poliwhirl. Gotta love Gen 1. Before we take on the Island Kahuna Olivia, we pass through the Akala outskirts where we can find Stuffle, which we're immediately able to evolve into Beware. Olivia's rock types are never that big a threat in this game, but with a team full of fighting types, the battle literally lasts for 3 turns, I'm not exaggerating. Things get a lot more troublesome for us as we reach Ula Ula. Much like when we got to Akala, we're greeted by an instant problem. How in this game is no joke, and in this fight, he already has a fully evolved Raichu with Psychic. That would one-shot every single one of my Pokemon if given the chance, and unfortunately, it's got base 110 speed. The only thing I have that can compete with that is Hawlucha, which unfortunately doesn't have the power at base 92 attack to one-shot it with its most powerful move, U-Turn. My second best option, Passimian, unfortunately has only 80 base speed. It does, however, have a speed-boosting nature, and the way the numbers work out, I need to invest maximum speed EVs in order to just barely outspeed this Raichu. I'm telling you this now because in the battle, it just looks like I hit this Raichu with a U-turn and the fight's over. But in reality, if I didn't do all that calculating and EV training prior to the fight, the run would just be over right here and now. The rest of the fight is fortunately incredibly easy, and we get to continue the run with our team intact. Moving on towards the observatory, I make sure to pick up Pancham on Route 10 and not 11. We won't be able to evolve it for a good while, but if we lose Pancham, we lose the run, so I gotta keep it out of trouble. Reaching Reaching the top of the mountain, we've got to face the next boss, Totem Togedemaru, which, as you might imagine, is not a boss I'm too afraid of because of its steel typing. It does get +2 defense from its aura, meaning it will be a bit tougher to take down than just brick-breaking ones. There's only one potential ally Pokemon for this fight, and it's Skarmory, which is perfect since it doesn't have any flying moves. In fact, its only attacking move is Steel Wing, which every single one of my Pokemon resist. Togedemaru does have the super effective bounce, however, with the fluffy ability, Beware can tank it for days. And even through the +2 defense, Brick Break is dealing massive damage. The one big issue I run into is getting paralyzed from bounce. It's not the biggest deal, but it eventually leads me to swapping out into Machoke. That ends up not really working out for me either, as I just barely hang on with 2 HP due to Eviolite and then get tormented, allowing me to at least get in a Brick Break, which doesn't even get the KO. Predictably, however, the AI is most likely going to go for bounce, so I decide to just swap into Poliwrath since there's no risk of it going for Zing Zap. From there, we just tank the bounce and take out the remaining 1 HP with a Brick Break. And since Skarmory can't really touch me, the rest of the fight is a piece of cake. Unfortunately, the story immediately launches us into a fight with Guzma. Not only do bug types resist fighting, but this guy's got a Masquerain with a deadly Air Slash. I definitely needed a strategy around this since we're forced to fight this guy 3 times in the run. He starts out with Golisopod, which luckily is very easy to work around. As long as we can deal over half with something like an Aerial Ace, we trigger Emergency Exit, swapping it out for Masquerain immediately. This does mean we get our attack lowered by Intimidate, however, a quad-effective Rock Tomb is still enough to one-shot the Masquerain. We do still have to take care of the Golisopod, and unfortunately, a single Aerial Ace isn't enough to take it out after that Intimidate. Golisopod doesn't actually have any super effective moves though, so we easily survive, taking it out and winning us the fight. This is the part of the game, however, where things start to get a lot worse. Starting now, all the future totem fights have every single one of their stats boosted, and facing Mimikyu, a ghost fairy type, we couldn't possibly have a worse type matchup if we tried. On top of that, Mimikyu starts out the fight with its Disguise ability, meaning we have to waste our first move breaking it and dealing no damage at all. Beware's fluffy ability and a decent amount of HP investment lets us tank Playrough fairly comfortably. I then decide to break Mimikyu's Disguise with Bulldoze since that at least gets the secondary effect of lowering its speed to neutral. Mimikyu then calls in its first ally Pokemon, Banette. This thing loves to Will-O-Wisp, which is a huge problem for my fully physical team. However, knowing this, we can actually use it to our advantage. After I'm taken low by a second Playrough, I get burned by the Will-O-Wisp, which we can easily heal off with a Lumberry. Now that we're not burned, this full power Shadow Claw is enough to just take out Banette in 1 hit. Beware has definitely taken a beating though, so I've got to swap it out, sending in Poliwrath, who sadly immediately gets cripped by a Playrough and barely gets to contribute to the run. Alright, that didn't go so well, but at least we get a free switch into Passimian. An Ironhead does a decent amount of damage, and while we could have tanked a Playrough, it ends up missing. Mimikyu then calls for its second ally Pokemon, Jellicent. I've just got to keep hitting this thing, so I go for another Ironhead, which very fortunately gets the flinch. However, my good luck doesn't last long, since the Water Pulse immediately gets a confusion. I deliberate for a while whether or not to risk it, but in the end, that's never a good way to play Nuzlocks. My basic thinking here is that Passimian will be more useful than Machoke no matter what. So if I'm gonna lose Passimian to a random confusion, I might as well lose Machoke instead, since this gives me a free switch into Passimian, now not confused, who's guaranteed to take out the Mimikyu the following turn with an Ironhead. From there, the Jellicent tries its best, but this time fails to get a confusion with Water Pulse, which allows me to take it out in 1 shot the next turn with a Seed Bomb. We lost 2 Pokemon there, but that could have been a lot worse. Defeating Mimikyu gives us access to Route 16, where we can find our next encounter, a Scraggy. Scraggy is a fantastic pickup, since not only can we evolve it immediately, but since it's a dark type, it also allows us to evolve Pancham into Pangoro. From there, we have to go into the second Guzma fight. However, this one is not very different from the first. I can just emergency exit the Golisopod and then take out the Masquerain with the exact same strategy. He also has a Pinsir, but Pure Fighting resists every single one of its moves, so the rest of the fight is free. Before we can head to the Aether Foundation and face the most insane set of bosses in any Pokemon game, we've got to face Nanu. This fight isn't very difficult in the first place, but with fighting types, it's incredibly easy to beat as dark types. Before we get to face Lusamine, there is an obstacle in our way, and it's Guzma once again, but this time, his team is actually formidable. With much better moves and a Vikavolt this time around, we've got to take Guzma seriously. However, I start the fight just the same as the other two by going for Aerial Ace to take Golisopod below half and sending it out with Emergency Exit. This time around, however, we're met with Vikavolt. Not wanting to be struck down by Thunderbolt, I go for U-turn, which which actually does a decent amount of damage with a crit, and swap into Goku. Scrafty doesn't take too much from Thunderbolt because it's fully invested in special defense. Guzma then does me a massive solid by swapping out his Vikavolt into Masquerain as I click Rock Slide. No idea why he puts his biggest threat to my team right in front of a quad effective move, but it is a massive favor and I really appreciate it, bud. This also activates Moxie, which just neutralizes Intimidate. Pinsir comes in next, and it does have super effective Storm Throw, so I decide to swap out going into Piccolo. However, Pinsir doesn't even go for it, hitting me with a quad-resisted X-Scissor. I stay in and go for Aerial Ace, even though I know that Pinsir has Stone Edge, but because of my fighting type, it isn't super effective. From there, a second Aerial Ace is all it takes, and Pinsir's done for. Guzma does still have the problematic Vikavolt, though. Once again, not wanting to be struck out of the sky, I go for U-turn to deal a bit more damage, which again gets a critical hit. This time I swap into Pangoro, who's also fully invested in special defense. This way, I'm able to tank the Thunderbolt, and because Vikavolt is slow as dirt for some reason, even though it looks like a fighter jet, I take it out with a crunch. Guzma is now only left with his initial Pokemon Golisopod, and expecting it to go for first impression, I swap out into Passimian. The resisted hit still does pretty good damage, but at half health, a Rock Slide is definitely enough to take out the Golisopod, winning us the fight. I don't know why Nintendo insists that we fight Guzma and Lysander 3 times each, but I'm glad to be done with them. Before taking on Lusamine, I make sure to get my next encounter through Ultra Sun and Moon's Island Scan feature. This is available in every version of Ultra Sun and Moon, and it's why it was so important that we caught Pancham on Route 10 and not 11. This is because Monferno is only available on Route 11 through Island Scan. I also realize Infernape makes a much better Goku, so I change Scrafty's nickname and evolve into Infernape. Lusamine poses an instant threat since her very first Pokemon is a Clefable with both Psychic and Moonblast. I'll say it now, if I need to sacrifice a Pokemon to get through this thing, I'll do what I gotta do. I start with Passimian, who's got the strongest Iron Head on the team, and to my surprise, I just end up getting the flinch. That definitely makes things easier for me, but the rest of Lusamine's team is also incredibly strong. Beware comes in next, and it's got Zen Headbutt, so I swap out with U-turn, which barely does anything because of Fluffy. I send in my own Beware, which also barely takes any damage from Dual Chop for the exact same reason, even though it's a critical hit. Unlike Lusamine's Beware, mine doesn't have post-game tutor moves, and I get struck very hard by a Drain Punch, healing the other Beware all the way up to full. My Brick Breaks don't even begin to compare. I was kind of expecting Beware to go down here, but I end up surviving on 3 HP, which at least lets me do a bit more damage before Beware goes down. It's sad to see Beware go down to one of its own kind, but there's really nothing I can do since I don't want to take a hit from this thing. Beware is so tanky that my only option to take it out from this range is to go for close combat with my strongest Pokemon. It's not a fantastic solution since it lowers my defenses for whatever Pokemon comes in next. Luckily, Passimian is faster than Lilligant, so we can deal a massive amount of damage, almost taking it out with U-turn and swap out at the same time into Piccolo. I end up getting paralyzed on the switch, which is a pain since I would outspeed otherwise. Lilligant then goes for Teeter Dance for the full Parafusion. My odds of making it through are not very good, but I actually end up hitting Acrobatics and just taking the Lilligant out. With 2 Pokemon left, Lusamine sends in Lopunny. With all of the elemental punches, I've gotta swap out, sending in Infernape. Oddly, the Lopunny goes for the only punch that isn't super effective against Hawlucha. The next turn I'm hit by Thunder Punch, which does considerably more damage before I decimate it with a close combat. It's not a big deal that my defenses are dropped here as I take it out, since Lusamine's final Pokemon is Milotic, so I'd be forced to swap out anyway. I send in my specially defensive tank Scrafty, expecting a Hydro Pump, but I'm struck with an Icy Wind. I suppose it wanted to lower Infernape's speed, but wouldn't just taking it out with Hydro Pump be so much better? Milotic then confuses me again by going for Dragon Pulse, but I guess it favors the accuracy. My Thunder Punch deals over 50% damage, so after taking another Dragon Pulse the next turn, I simply go for another Thunder Punch, finishing off the fight, and at least I only had to lose 1 Pokemon. This lets us go to the craziest location in the game, Pony Island. Before challenging Komodo, I fill up my team by capturing my own Jangmo-o. We could have gotten Mienfoo in this slot, and unfortunately, there's no other location for us to get it. Not a huge loss though, since Komodo is probably the better encounter. And speaking of Komodo, that's exactly the 7th Titan Pokemon, and Komodo with an Omni Boost is no joke. Usually you're not able to deal too much damage to this thing, and it calls in Noivern, which would be a death sentence to us. If we could deal over half damage though, it would call in Scizor, which would be way more manageable. I start the fight with Piccolo to bait Komodo into going for Thunder Punch, which we're able to survive with a Wakan Berry. Not only does surviving the hit allow us to take Komodo below half health with a full power acrobatics now that we're not holding an item. Getting rid of the item also activates Unburden, which doesn't let us outspeed priority bullet punch, but it does let us outspeed +1 Komodo to take it out with a second acrobatics. Another bullet punch from Scizor would likely take me out here, but all of its moves are resisted by Infernape, so I can safely swap it in, and after tanking some measly bullet punches, I can one-shot the Scizor with a fire punch. But the truth is, that boss fight is child's play compared to what's to come. After beating the 7th trial, we're forced to go to Ultra Space to take down Ultra Necrozma, and with one look at this thing's stats, you already know it's a classic run killer. Did I mention all of them are at +1 and it's 5 levels above the level cap? All these things combine into the most unfair Pokemon boss fight of all time. The most common way to beat this boss is to waste your 1 Focus Sash and sacrifice 3 to 4 Pokemon in order to guaranteed beat it. You do this through poisoning it with your Focus Sash lead, but we don't have the amount of encounters in order to afford that strategy. So I had to come up with something better that didn't lose quite as many Pokemon. This is the entire reason why Pangoro is fully trained in special defense. This way we can just barely survive a non-crit Dragon Pulse and get an attack boost from a Lychee Berry. I then fire off a 100 base power +1 stab super effective payback, and it's still not enough to take Necrozma out. I get some more chip damage with Bullet Punch, but ultimately this was Pangoro's job. Ultra Necrozma having both 97 base HP and defense at +1 makes it almost impossible to one-shot it. However, with 2 dark types that can't get hit super effectively by psychic moves, fully trained in special defense, we're able to take out Ultra Necrozma with only 1 casualty. I was relieved to only lose Pangoro, but the game doesn't give me any time to celebrate since the very next boss fight in the game is versus Totem Rabombi, a bug fairy type. This thing is completely ridiculous. Not only does it quad resist fighting, it's also super effective. On top of that, because this is the last island trial of the game, instead of getting +1 from its aura, Totem Rabombi gets +2 to every single one of its stats. I only had one option, and I was very glad to still have my Focus Sash to be able to hang on 1 HP after a Dazzling Gleam. I then connect with a full power acrobatics for over half health, and Rabombi calls in its ally Pokemon Blissey. However, consuming my item, much like versus Komodo, activates Unburden and allows me to outspeed Rabombi to take it out with a second acrobatics. Sadly from there, there's no way of stopping Blissey from taking my final hit point. Hawlucha has seriously carried the run up until this point, all the way until his last moment. Blissey being a specially defensive normal type, it's incredibly easy to just come in and clean up to defeat the final trial. Before the Pokemon League, we still have to take on the final island trial, so I head to Executor Island and activate Island Scan. Here on Thursdays, we're able to capture Chestnut, and this thing just happens to be the perfect Pokemon to take on Hapu. And I mean it, Chestnut tears our team apart like it's a sheet of paper. At this point, there's only one more encounter left in the game, an island scan we can get on Route 8, which is why I captured Stuffle in Akala Outskirts instead. Here we're able to get a second fire starter in Combuskin, and with that I had my final Elite Four team, starting with Cell the Passimian with Ironhead, Rock Slide, Seed Bomb, and Close Combat, Broly the Scrafty with Brick Break, Crunch, Thunder Punch, and Ice Punch, Frieza the Bulletproof Komodo with Close Combat, Ice Punch, Shadow Claw, and Outrage, Krillin the Chestnut with Spiky Shield, Ironhead, Leech Seed, and Toxic, Master Roshi the Blaziken with High Jump Kick, Flare Blitz, Brave Bird, and Thunder Punch, and Son Goku the Infernape with Power Up Punch, Close Combat, Fire Punch, and Thunder Punch. And so begins the Elite Four Challenge, and I decided to take on Olivia and her rock types first. Fighting types being super effective, I felt pretty good about this matchup and started out with Krillin. Armaldo's X-Scissor is neutral because of my grass type, but it still doesn't do too much damage as I set up my Leech Seed to get recovery back. I then go for a Spiky Shield to maximize the recovery. This gets me all the way back to full HP, as Armaldo then hits me with an X-Scissor and an Ironhead takes it into range where Leech Seed is just enough to drain it out. I could have easily just gone for 2 Ironheads, but I would have been left with way less health going up against her next Pokemon, Lycanroc. It hits me with a Rock Climb because it really doesn't have any good moves to hit me with, so I'm able to set up a Leech Seed to continue to recover. After some Spiky Shielding, I hit it with an Ironhead, once again putting it in range, being taken out by the Leech Seed recovery. With Lycanroc defeated, Olivia's third Pokemon is Gigalith, setting up the sand with Sandstream as it comes in. I once again go for the Slow Burn with Leech Seed since this Gigalith can barely hurt me with its strongest move against me, Ironhead. I also poison it to take it down as fast as possible, which ends up being its downfall. Cradily comes in next, and because it's a grass type, I can't affect it with Leech Seed, so I poison it instead and eventually take it out with Iron Head. Finally, she's got a Probopass, which is immune to poison, but I can Leech Seed it and eventually take it out with Iron Head for the victory. Second, I decide to take on the Master of Ghost type's Acerola, which theoretically should be a huge problem for our fighting types. However, Scrafty is of course also a dark type. Her lead Banette uses Screech, which I'm not too worried about since it's her only physical Pokemon. A single crunch is then enough to take out the ghost in a single bite. This has the bonus effect of giving us more attack with Moxie. Frostlass is second, and the most annoying thing it could possibly do is go for Confuse Ray, which could throw off this entire fight. So I prepared with a Lumberry to get rid of the imminent confusion. And even without my attack boost from Moxie, I'd still be able to take out Frostlass in a single crunch. This gets me a second Moxie boost, and at this point, all of Acerola's Pokemon are really slow, so Dhelmise just goes down immediately to a +2 crunch. Same goes for Palossand, which at this point falls to the power of +3. Her final Pokemon, Drifblim, is actually faster than Scrafty, but it has a set mostly focused on powering up her other Pokemon, which are already dead. So I destroy the Drifblim with a +4 crunch and take a little bit of aftermath damage, winning me the fight. Thirdly, I take on Molayne, and even though he has steel types, this is where things begin to get a bit more tricky. He begins the fight with a Klefki that has a really annoying prankster set. So I lead with the best option of my own, one of my 2 fire starters, Infernape. I get immediately paralyzed by Thunder Wave, which is super obvious, which is why I equipped Infernape with a Lumberry to heal it off. I then go for Flamethrower instead of a physical move since there's a chance Klefki would set up Reflect. Molayne then uses a full restore, so I take Klefki right back down to the red. Using this strategy, I knew Klefki would likely be able to permanently paralyze me with a second Thunder Wave. The reason I equipped the Lumberry wasn't to avoid getting paralyzed completely, just to make the process of taking out Klefki a bit smoother. Alolan Dugtrio comes in second, threatening to one-shot me with an Earthquake, so I swap into Krillin, who resists it with its Grass type. Krillin takes barely any damage from the Earthquake, but a ton of damage the following turn from the Steel Z move. From there, however, a single Earthquake in retaliation is all it takes to take Alolan Dugtrio out. Metagross comes in next, and I am one Zen Headbutt from being taken out, so I swap out into Broly, who can dodge the Zen Headbutt with its Dark typing. I was expecting Hammer Arm, but Metagross goes for Meteor Mash instead, which doesn't even do half, allowing me to deal super effective damage with Crunch. Now Metagross decides to go for the Hammer Arm, but with a held Chople Berry, it doesn't deal enough to take Broly out. This is bad news for Metagross, since a second crunch is definitely enough to take it out. With the biggest threat out of the way, Molayne's second to last Pokemon is Magnezone. At such low health, I definitely need to swap out, so I send in Frieza to resist a Thunderbolt with its Dragon typing. I remain above half and get a bit of health back from my leftovers. I then go for Shadow Claw, but it doesn't really matter what move I use here since I just do it to break Magnezone's sturdy. Flash Cannon deals a lot more damage than Thunderbolt and even lowers my special defense, which doesn't end up mattering since a close combat just takes out the Magnezone. At this point, Molayne is left with his final Pokemon, possibly the most useless Pokemon you could ever send into a team full of fighting types, Bisharp. Blaziken resists literally every single one of this thing's moves, so I just go for a Flare Blitz to take it out, not wanting to risk missing the high jump kick. With Molayne defeated, there's only one Elite Four member left, and it's a fight that I've been dreading since the very start of the run. With a team full of fighting types, facing Kahili's fearsome flyers sounds like a nightmare. She leads with Braviary, and I literally don't have a good option on my team to face any of her Pokemon. I do, however, have a strategy with Passimian to take it out with a couple of Rock Slides and survive with a Koba Berry. However, once again, Passimian way over-delivers, getting the Rock Slide flinch, meaning that I take out the Braviary without using my Koba Berry. Kahili's second Pokemon is the bulky Mandibuzz. The plan here was to go for close combat immediately after my Koba Berry was used up, but since I still have it, I decide to go for Rock Slide instead, which ends up getting me confused by Flatter. This is not great, since now there's a chance I don't get off that close combat damage. I of course end up hitting myself in confusion as the Mandibuzz goes for Brave Bird, which we can at least survive because of that Koba Berry. Passimian then snaps out of confusion in a clutch moment and takes out the Mandibuzz with close combat, lowering its defense and special defense. Third is Kahili's ace Pokemon, Toucannon. I can't exactly switch anything into this Z move, so I decide to just go for Rock Slide, dealing massive damage before Cell finally falls. Now that Toucannon has used up its Z move, it's time to use my secret strategy. Toucannon charges up Beak Blast, so I poison it with Toxic so that I don't get burned. Beak Blast then tries to connect, but Kommo-o is bulletproof. The other two attacking moves this thing has are Bullet Seed and Rock Blast, which are both stopped by Bulletproof. I could still get burned if I use a physical move as it goes for Beak Blast, so instead, I just shuffle between Protect and Toxic, which eventually adds up to taking the Toucannon out. Second to last is Oricorio. The real problem on our team is Hawlucha, since Cobra Berry can't stop Flying Press. Hawlucha also outspeeds every single one of my Pokemon and one-shots all but one. If I want to make it through this fight at all, I need to execute my strategy. Oricorio acts as sort of a nuisance before we face the real problem, since it lowers my attack with Feather Dance and confuses me. I'm able to take very little damage from an Air Slash with my special defense investment and the help of a Cobra Berry. I of course just end up flinching, rendering the berry useless, but the next turn I connect with a Thunder Punch, taking the Oricorio low. The Oricorio then goes for Teeter Dance to continue being maximally annoying. Wouldn't be right if I didn't hit myself in confusion, so I'm forced to swap out. I decide to send in Goku since he's faster than Oricorio, and with a held Cobra Berry, I can survive the incoming Air Slash. Without these berries from Pony Island, I think this fight would just be impossible. Infernape takes out Oricorio with a Thunder Punch, leaving Kahili with her final Pokemon, Hawlucha. Now here, I need to get Kommo-o in safely without getting hit, leaving me with a simple choice. I have to sacrifice something, I just need to decide what it is. In the end, I think I went with the wrong choice. Trying to diversify my team, I decided to sacrifice Master Roshi. I think the optimal play would have been to sacrifice Krillin and keeping Blaziken alive for the champion fight. I think that would have given me the best chance to win, but in this case, I sacrificed Blaziken to get in Frieza for free. Strategically, I've kept Frieza at full health to be able to survive a Flying Press and then fire back with a full power Outrage, which with max attack investment is just enough to finish off the fight and defeat Kahili. Going up against the champion, I've only got 4 Pokemon left and no idea how to defeat his Primarina. More pressingly, however, he starts out with his Raichu. I send in Scrafty, but it's got Focus Blast, which misses. Not uncommon for Focus Miss to miss, but this might actually give us a chance as I take out Raichu in a single hit, getting a Moxie boost. Of course, this means we'll have to fight Primarina, but I think I'll need Scrafty for later, so I swap in Goku, expecting a Moonblast. Because Fire resists Fairy, the Moonblast actually isn't enough to take Goku out, leaving me in the red. The best I can do from there is firing off a Thunder Punch, dealing over half damage. After that, Primarina completely flushes my Infernape down the drain. Here it would have been fantastic to just finish it off with Blaziken, but sadly, I'm left with Krillin. I unfortunately don't have any Grass-type moves to attack with since I entered the Elite Four without any. I will at least be able to do something after surviving a Moonblast with the help of a held Roselli Berry. But the best I can do is just set up a Leech Seed. No matter how much recovery I get, I won't be able to survive a Moonblast, but I can go for Spiky Shield the next turn in order to get as much damage on Primarina as possible, taking it deep into the red. Hal predictably goes for a full restore here, which unlike other status conditions doesn't actually heal off Leech Seed. This way I'm able to get Primarina poisoned as well, and now we've got 2 statuses chipping away at this thing every single turn. I of course proceed with Spiky Shield in order to get as much damage as possible on this thing before I eventually go down. I fish for the double Spiky Shield, but don't end up getting lucky, and a Moonblast takes Krillin down forever. This means I won't get any Leech Seed damage this turn, but poison still ticks away. With only 2 Pokemon left, I send in Frieza, who does still have Protect in its moveset from the last fight. This lets me not get struck down by the quad-effective Moonblast, and with Leech Seed and Toxic, it's almost enough to take Primarina out. Just enough to let a Bulldoze take it out the next turn, and at least we're rid of that problem. Hal still has 4 Pokemon left on his team though, versus R2. To begin evening those odds, I immediately take out Crabominable with a single close combat. Shame I never got to use that thing. His third Pokemon is Noivern, and a massive problem after my defense is just dropped, so I have to swap out into Broly, who at least still has that special defense. It hits me with Dragon Pulse, doing about 30%. If it would have gone for Air Slash here instead, I did have the Cobra Berry to survive the hit. Either way, I would have connected with this quad-effective Ice Punch, taking out the Noivern in one shot. Now that we both have 2 Pokemon left, Hal sends in Flareon. I probably should have swapped in Kommo-o here to take the resisted Flare Blitz, but instead, Broly goes down, leaving me with only 1 final Pokemon. As I swap in Kommo-o, Flareon immediately goes for Baby Doll Eyes, lowering my attack permanently since I don't have any Pokemon to swap into. I then go for a Bulldoze, which does do over half, meaning a second one the next turn takes out Flareon, leaving Hal with the same amount of Pokemon Pokemon as I have. Sadly, that Pokemon's Tauros, which gets us to -2 attack with Intimidate. I'm hit with a Stab Double Edge, which does about 40%, and I try for damage with Bulldoze, but it's not going to be enough to let me outspeed, let alone do any damage at all. Desperately, I click Protect to try and get some Leftovers recovery back, but it looks like I'm going to stumble right at the end. Tauros hits me with another Double Edge, which the next turn will finish me off. So I click Close Combat. Without even getting a critical hit, somehow I done it. A -2 close combat was enough to take out Tauros, which means I beat a Pokemon Ultra Sun Hardcore Nuzlocke with only fighting types. I didn't even think I'd make it, but with one Pokemon remaining, that was one of the most intense Nuzlockes I've ever played in my life. So if you want to see more like this, subscribe.